It seemed that each time the emperor finished a picture, he pasted it here under a layer of the stuff. There must be quite a few more works here. Maomao still had a question, though, about the emperor's painting supplies. The surface of the wallpaper was coated with glue or something similar to help pigment adhere easily to it. That explained the clear shards she had found earlier. He likely dissolved them to make his paints. As for the brushes, one could make their own brushes as long as they had access to animal hair. But what about the reams of paper and the piles of stones, the ingredients for pigments that would be necessary? They were not found just anywhere. Maomao stood looking at the faded golden hue of the ornament and thought. It seemed to her that everyone here would know who the subject of the painting was, this one adult woman. He had hardly ever looked at a grown woman. Even a shadow, at which he was unable to gaze for long, loomed behind him. The Empress Regnant must have known, Maomao thought. She must have realized her son was not fit to be king. That is why she consolidated power for herself and worked hard to protect him. She wanted to keep her child safe, even though he had almost stumbled into leadership. She had become known as an empress in her own right, practically. It was ironic, then, if her last gift to her son was this place and those painting supplies. Maomao didn't say any of this aloud. She quietly left the room, glancing at the former slave to confirm what she was thinking. He had his eyes closed and his head bowed as if in prayer. Perhaps he was the one who received the supplies from the Empress Regnant and brought them to His Majesty. Neither of them knew that the gifts were poisonous. The Empress Dowager, in contrast, was gazing up into the sky. She seemed to be asking a question to someone somewhere beyond the sapphire vault that arched above them. Perhaps she had a sentimental streak that inspired the gesture. Maomao shook her head. She bowed in deference. "I've told you all I can." Anchi slowly reached out toward the wall. The wall was still covered haphazardly with pieces of paper. A self-recriminating smile was on her face. This palace woman, Maomao, had given her a thorough explanation. Perhaps she had even revealed things that would have been better left unknown. Anchi knew exactly who the woman in the painting on the wall was. Her image was faded, but her presence remained strong. Who was she? Perhaps she was one of the young women surrounding the central figure. Then again, she might not even be among them. Maybe she had been nothing more than a passing moment for him, someone he simply saw briefly. The thought made anger surge within her. She touched her belly, feeling the scar she knew was there. This scar had made her what she now was, mother to the country. People regarded Anchi as an object of pity, or sometimes of amusement. Some people felt sympathy for her. The poor little girl His former Majesty had just happened to get pregnant. It was true that he had impregnated a young woman, but Anchi had been aware of the ruler's sexual proclivities beforehand. Her father had been a civil official, and Anchi was his illegitimate daughter. She began menstruating earlier than most girls her age. She also always looked younger than she actually was. Her father simply saw this as a useful advantage and took advantage of it. She closed her eyes and remembered that day. One of her relatives was a eunuch who served in the rear palace. He knew the emperor's behavior very well. He visited the rear palace every few days, making the rounds of the upper consorts. He sometimes visited the middle consorts as well, but he never stayed the night. He might take a walk through the gardens, but he would leave soon after. Anchi began her service as a lady-in-waiting to one of the middle consorts, who was also an older half-sister of hers. The older woman did not know what Anchi's father planned. She spent all her time hoping His Majesty would visit her. He did come, giving Anchi her chance sooner than she expected. A eunuch guided the sovereign as he came to see his newest middle consort. Anchi was young, but she could see he wasn't very interested in the visit. Her half-sister, however, seemed oblivious. Her half-sister's every thought was of attracting the emperor's attention. Anchi didn't remember exactly how it had started. She just remembered that suddenly the emperor was shoving her sister aside. This caused her sister to tumble to the ground. He leaned against the wall, his face cast down. A lady-in-waiting should have either comforted her mistress or apologized to the ruler for any impertinence that had provoked him. But Anchi did neither. Instead she said, "Are you quite all right, sir?" This might have been considered improper. In fact, the eunuchs around His Majesty told her not to touch him and pushed her away. She thought she might be punished along with her half-sister, but things turned out quite differently. All her half-sister had tried to do was touch the emperor, and only gently at that. She had dreamed of the Rhea Palace, and now she was there. Her sovereign was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Raised to be a butterfly, to be a flower, Anshi's half-sister had simply gotten carried away. Anshi, though, had caught a glimpse of the emperor's expression as he stared down at the ground. His eyebrows, delicate like willow branches, were knit together. Tears poured from his eyes. He was rubbing his left arm vigorously, as if to rid himself of a sensation. It seemed his half-sister had touched it. This was not the image one would expect from a man at the top of his nation. He was a weakling, terrified by a middle consort who could barely pull herself up off the floor, and who should approach that timorous man but a heedless 10-year-old girl. Time passed, and as Anshi ceased to look like a little girl, the emperor stopped making any effort to visit her. Maybe she was now also something he feared. Anshi's half-sister had been made mad by jealousy. She was eventually married to remove her from the Rhea Palace. Anshi never learned what happened to her after that. She had heard that years later her half-sister died of illness. By then, Anshi was already Empress Dowager and in mourning for her husband. Therefore she was unable to attend the funeral. She was hardly the last little girl to arrive at the Rhea Palace with the task of drawing His Majesty's interest. Many came after her. The Rhea Palace grew quickly, and 3 new zones were added. The section constructed when her husband became emperor was now the southern quarter. Anshi faced threats to her life many times. She was fortunate that her child was a boy, and that his grandmother, the Empress Regnant, acknowledged him. Once the emperor refused to acknowledge a daughter born to one of his ladies. This led to both the child and the medical officer thought to be its father being banished. Until then, medical officials had been the only men exempt from castration while serving in the Rhea Palace. But after that event, it was declared that even doctors would have to be eunuchs. Anshi felt pain knowing this was why the physician who operated on her belly had been castrated. She thought that when the emperor was painting here, he was likely thinking only of his mother, the Empress Regnant, or perhaps he was thinking of girls who would not challenge him. She had no place in such imaginings. The sovereign was as terrified of her as he had been of her half-sister who had tried to touch him. Perhaps he was even more terrified now. When her second child was born, some people thought the child must be illegitimate, but Anshi simply laughed. That could never be. She had never seen His Majesty so scared. He was nothing more than the Empress Regnant's puppet. He was a pathetic man overwhelmed by adult women. He could engage only with little girls. To be forgotten by someone like that was unbearable. The feelings exploded when she saw the emperor pass her by to be with his new favorite playmate. Anshi confronted him with the scar on her belly and tormented him as he begged for forgiveness, yet it felt like nothing compared to what he had inflicted on all those little girls. In bed she continued to whisper spiteful curses to him. She wanted to wound him more than all of those children put together. She wanted him to remember her. She wanted him to remember her more than any of the girls he had hurt. She wanted him to remember her more than his august mother, the Empress Regnant. What kind of picture had that been? Just once the emperor had painted Anshi. He looked so at peace as he worked with his brush painting. It was his little secret. She cherished the painting, but later told her lady-in-waiting to throw it away. Anshi had no more need for the former emperor, just as he had had no more need of her. When she realized her child might be in danger, she acted quickly and decisively. Let people say he was illegitimate or a changeling. She loved him just the same. It was then that she began to realize something she hadn't understood clearly before. Anshi took a step back from the picture on the wall. Outside the room stood the lady-in-waiting who was always with her. She turned her glance to one side and occasionally fidgeted. There on the wall was a face so beautiful it could only be called superhuman. It resembled someone Anshi had once known. This person had astonished even her with their beauty. That person was gone and the painting was from decades ago. Few people would still be alive who could identify the image. I remember he visited us once, didn't he? Yes, Anshi said. It was many years ago. Jinchi was with her. He was talking about something that occurred over 10 years prior. It was likely around the time the previous emperor started to isolate himself within this building. By then, he was already losing his hold on reality. Anshi did not wish to pursue the question of why. She remembered the Empress Regnant had come quickly, comforting her beloved son and taking him away. Jinchi said that was when I picked this up. He showed her a golden stone he held in a handkerchief. I understand its name is orpiment. She was impressed by his detachment, so the poison had been ravaging his former majesty even then. Suhyun finally gave it back to me this morning, precisely as Anshi had once instructed her, all those years ago. If he plays too much with one thing, take it away from him. So that was what they had done, never understanding how cruel it really was. Each time the boy had looked up at her, seeking to judge her mood, she had reflexively avoided his gaze. She had done a terrible thing. Perhaps that was what made him grow up so quickly, even though a child's heart still beat within him. I seem to remember seeing one of his drawings. It showed a young woman in delicate colors. Perhaps this color sparked a memory in me because of that picture. So Suhyun had quietly kept the painting Anshi told her to throw away. You always did like to wear yellow, Jinchi continued. It was only happenstance. Her family had produced a great deal of turmeric, and the clothing she'd worn had therefore naturally included much yellow. She'd simply never stopped wearing it. Finally he asked, is the woman in that picture indeed the Empress Regnant? I certainly don't know. What do you suppose he was trying to communicate at that moment? I certainly don't know, nor was there any way to find out now. She had chosen not to ask the question. I see you have found yourself quite an interesting palace woman, Anshi said, trying to change the subject. Someone who is quite useful. It was true, she could hear it in his voice. But she could also tell it wasn't the whole story. She had fought and survived on this battlefield for far longer than he had. How many years did he think she had been watching him? I see. She half closed her eyes, feeling she had to communicate this much at least. But if you do not take care to hide your favorites, someone might hide them from you. And with that, Anshi returned to her own room. Chapter 15 Scary Stories. The long-promised new palace women finally arrived. 3 people arrived at the Jade Pavilion. Everyone except Maomao seemed to know them already. Maomao watched the 3 newcomers and thought to herself, their names do not quite match their appearances. Maomao mostly remembered things that interested her. Because of this, it was difficult for her to start conversations with the new girls for a little while. She had never been much of a talker to begin with, so a simple hey you would work. There was a bigger problem to address. Maomao, it's time for you to go back to your room, Yinghua said, placing her hands on her hips. I was told this was my room, Maomao replied, almost clinging to the small storage shed she had been given in the Jade Pavilion garden. She had filled it with tools and dried herbs. She had finally finished moving everything from her old rooms. That was just a joke, of course. Why are you taking it so seriously? What kind of example would this set for the new girls? Yinghua wanted to know. She said, it is no problem, just let me stay here. You cannot. Come on, the girls are looking at us. They made quite a sight. Maomao was clinging to a post in the shed and Yinghua was trying to detach her from it. Chief Lady-in-Waiting Hongyang would never stand for 2 of her subordinates making such a display. Both Maomao and Yinghua took a good smack. Maomao moved back to her old room in the end. When she saw the large amount of equipment and ingredients in the storage shed, Hongyang finally seemed to accept what was happening. She reported the matter to Consort Jyokayu, and the consort, who always liked interesting things, laughed. She said Maomao could do as she wished with the shed. She had to sleep in her quarters, but otherwise she could do what she liked. Maomao marveled at what a fine boss she had. Yinghua, predictably, looked put out. Now she watched as Maomao gleefully began working in the little building. The tea party was finished, and they had no more duties until dinner. With the 3 new girls helping, the amount of work each of them had to do decreased significantly. A sigh escaped Maomao. This would not do. Yinghua's remark Maomao did not truly believe it was any of her business, but she said it out of concern for Maomao. Probably, Yinghua hoped that Maomao would start getting along with the newcomers sooner rather than later. At snack time today, she tried hard to get Maomao and the new trio all involved in the conversation. Yinghua was thoughtful in that way. Maomao set down the polyporaceae mushroom she was holding. She looked out of the storage shed at Yinghua. After a moment she said, I am sorry. I know I have been a bit self-absorbed. Yinghua said it is all the same to me, and her lips were still pursed. Maomao watched her, not quite daring to come out from behind the wall. She thought, you can do what you want. But Yinghua turned so the wall was between her and Maomao, and then she said, I'm going to borrow you this evening, all right? Then she grabbed Maomao's hand and grinned a rather intimidating grin. Yipes. We are the only ones who are free tonight, Maomao. It's perfect timing. She shook Maomao's hand vigorously, obviously really enthused. She got me, Maomao thought, heaving a sigh and staring at the shrewd lady-in-waiting. Maomao found herself brought to a dilapidated building in the rear palace's northern quarter. She had worried that Hongniang would not give them permission to go out so late at night. However, Hongniang had been surprisingly willing. She said a person ought to be a part of that sort of thing from time to time. What did she mean by that sort of thing? Maomao wondered what was going on. She followed Yinghua as they walked by the light of a small lantern. The breeze felt overwarm and uncomfortable. She kept hearing bugs buzz around her ears, but she did not complain. They stopped at the entrance to the building. Yinghua said, here, Maomao, put this on. She held out a thin cloth. Maomao asked, isn't it going to be hot? Yinghua replied, don't worry, you'll cool down soon, come on. Maomao was perplexed but did as she was told. Yinghua rapped on the door and a palace woman appeared from inside. She said, welcome. 2 participants, yes, thank you, a pleasure to have you. Yinghua bowed and Maomao followed her lead. The woman who met them smiled and gave them each a small flame. She asked them to put out their lantern. She was beautiful even in the dim light, but perhaps a little older than the average inhabitant of the rear palace. The inside of the building looked every bit as weathered as the outside. The building did not seem worn by time so much as it had declined quickly after people stopped using it. It had been cleaned only a little, but some of the fittings were not very good and the floor creaked. This building was used during the time of the last emperor, the woman told them. The rear palace seemed very full of women now. However, there had actually been even more women here during the reign of the previous monarch. These women came from all over the nation. They were shut away inside to bear a son for the sovereign. Now, with fewer ladies present, this place became uninhabited, though it was still used at times like this. But what was it being used for? When they arrived at a large room at the end of the hallway, about 10 other people were already there. They were sitting in a circle, and their faces were mostly covered with pieces of cloth. Each person held a flickering flame. This gave the place an eerie ambience. What were they doing here? What else did one do on a summer night? Very well, let us begin. The woman who had greeted them sat down. It appeared she was the hostess. Does everyone have their story ready? She produced a handful of twigs to use as lots. Tonight, she said, we shall savor 13 tales to chill the blood. The way the light danced across her grinning face made her truly unsettling. Evidently, Maomao was in for a night of scary stories. One woman sat at each of the 4 points of the compass. 2 more women sat in between each of them. Maomao held back a sigh as she sat there with a cloth over her head, half hiding her face. The first woman to speak seemed a little nervous. She delivered her story in such a halting manner that it was hard to take seriously. The story was not much more than one of the many rumors circulating in the rear palace. It was hardly a chilling tale. As the second storyteller prepared to begin, Maomao felt a nudge from her right. It was not Yinghua who was sitting to her left. Evening, a sweet voice whispered. Hello, Maomao said. She recognized the other woman, even with half of her face covered. It was Shisui. In the low light she hadn't noticed her until now. Shisui sleepily offered something to Maomao. She thought she caught a whiff of the seashore. Then she realized it was dried squid. Want some? Shisui asked. Yes, Maomao took a big bite, chewing slowly so as not to make any noise. The second woman told a perfectly unremarkable scary story, but at least it was a scary story, unlike the first woman's attempt. She managed to spook a few of the attendees. The cloth slipped from Yinghua's face, and sometimes Maomao could see her peeking out from between her fingers. That was her business, but she would also occasionally cling to Maomao. She was awfully strong for her relatively small size, and a couple of times Maomao was almost strangled. She is a scaredy cat, but she still enjoys this, Maomao thought. It was not unusual. She had probably invited Maomao along because she was afraid to come alone. Maomao was not particularly fond of storytelling get-togethers like this. However, they seemed to be widely accepted in the rear palace, where there were so few amusements. After all, even Hongniang had agreed to let them come here. Shisui was present as well, although Maomao had the feeling Shisui would have managed to show up with or without permission, and so it went, until half the women had told their stories. With each tale completed, one of the lights in the room went out. Now there was half as much light as there had been at the start. It was then the seventh woman's turn to tell a story. Maomao listened vacantly, chewing on a mouthful of squid. The woman's flame flickered on her pale face as she began to speak. This is a story from my hometown. There is a forest there, and everyone has always been told not to go into it.